Okay, wow, it's time. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If you're new, let me welcome you. If you are returning, thank you. And just, how is everyone doing? I have to admit, I'm right up against the wire on this intro in a way that I haven't been in a while. I know I've said that before, but I've been putting this off, just waiting to see if I could find a little bit of enthusiasm to bring to this intro for an amazing talk with Beryl Birch. But I haven't been having it. I haven't found it. My reservoir of enthusiasm feels like it has run a bit dry, which has happened somewhat suddenly. Last week I was riding a bit high. I, shortly after speaking to you, went to Kripalu for an incredible event hosted by Leslie Kaminoff that was celebrating the teacher TKV Desikachar. And really, that is the teacher that I would align with most on a very core level. Like what I do, some of the fundamental things that I'm teaching come from that particular teacher by way of some other teachers who were featured at this event, including Mark Whitwell, who's a teacher of mine who's been on this podcast, Gary Krafsow, who I've been trying to get on in the past and now said he would come on, and Mirka Krafsow, and Larry Payne, and Richard Miller, and a man named Sri Ram, who I only just met and recorded a fantastic talk with that you're going to get to listen to in a couple of weeks. And another guy named Navdej, who I'm going to try to reach out to as well. All of these people had studied directly with TKV Desikachar. And I have to say, it was an incredibly reaffirming event for me personally. I'm going to talk more about it when I share my talk with Sri Ram, but just to say, it was an incredibly rare occasion that all these people were together in the same place, and it felt like maybe some old hatchets got buried a little in some levels. Not that they were big hatchets, but just to see people really come together around some core principles really filled me up, and I was grateful for it. And like I said, I'm going to talk more about TKV Desikachar because I think he's an important teacher who hasn't had enough said about him yet. So we're going to talk about him soon. And that fueled me into last week where I had quite a bit of challenges. My wife went out of town quite last minute for a gig that she got. And so there was 4 days out of the 7 days of the week where I was solo parenting, which worked out okay. It was kind of amazing. My eldest daughter, I think she really liked the new babysitter we had, who was kind of young and had like a nose ring. And so she just wanted to impress her and show her that she was mature, I think. So she really was on really good behavior and took care of her little sister and made it easier for me. But I was running around, running to the studio for 3 hours, running back, letting go of the babysitter, just anybody listening to this who's a single parent, my heart is just out to you. It is an incredible challenge to both work and be a parent at the same time, all by yourself. Incredibly challenging. I did make it through quite well, and then my wife came back, and now they just left this morning. So now they went to Grandma and Grandpa's for the next week, and so now I'm sitting here by myself. I have the next week where I don't have to be a parent at all, and it feels like I'm in this backlash now. If I've been on and going, and and then now I'm just drained, and then there's all this crappy, scary stuff happening. And I just tuned into the news, and there's mass protests across the country. And like, I normally don't ever want to bring politics into this podcast because, one, I'm not really qualified to talk about politics. I don't really know what I'm talking about so much, just my own impressions and feelings, which aren't always all that informed. I'm not really all that educated on how politics and government works. But I know that what's happening right now feels very wrong to me. And it seems like we might really need to make an effort to fight what seems to me to be fascism in a way that has never happened in my lifetime before. Maybe that's a really big statement to make, but that's what it felt like to me. And so, I don't know, it felt, now I'm supposed to come on and be all excited. And I thought, what's to be excited right now? It's really difficult to withstand feelings of dread. But I'm not going to give in. That's why I've hit record and I am talking to you right now, because I am going to move forward. We have no choice. I have no choice but to carry on with my life and look for the opportunity to make the effort, because I think at some point we're all going to have to make an effort where we can to stand up for what we believe. Hopefully all has not been lost yet. So, sorry, Beryl, who's probably listening to this and being like, what? Why do I have to listen to Jay talk about all this crappy stuff? I thought he was going to play the cool talk we had. Because I have an incredibly cool talk to share with you with Beryl Birch. And if you're listening to this and you don't know who Beryl Birch is, all the more important reason for you to listen to this. Because in my opinion, Beryl is really one of the people who played a role in the way that yoga has come about in the West and in the way that we know yoga today. And it is an incredibly interesting conversation for me. Those of you who listen to this podcast know I always want to try to flesh out the history of how things happen. And Beryl was there. She studied with Pattabhi Jois, and we talk about that. And she coined the term power yoga, and she tells me about when that happened and how that came about. And really, it's a history lesson. And I'm super grateful that she gave me the time. And I am excited that you're going to get to hear it today. Before we do, let me mention that this episode of Yoga Talks is sponsored by yogalifestyle.com. And I have had a relationship to yogalifestyle.com for many years, long before they were sponsoring the podcast. The owner, Ray Greenberg, is a longtime friend of mine. He's been on this podcast before. You can go back and listen to that episode. But one of the reasons I chose to buy from yogalifestyle.com is that they have unique items that you can't find anywhere else. In particular, the Becca Long Life mat, which is the mat that I used at my yoga center. Without a doubt, it is the most durable of all the mats I've ever tried, and I've tried a lot of mats. I had a set of these that lasted 10 years. In my opinion, they're like the best mats, and you can only get them at yogalifestyle.com. Another thing is this teardrop-shaped bolster that Ray sent me when he started sponsoring the podcast that I've been laying on. These are examples of unique items that you can get at yogalifestyle.com. I highly recommend checking it out. yogalifestyle.com. This episode of Yoga Talks is also sponsored by Karmasoft, a complete online yoga studio management solution. You know Karmasoft if you've been listening to this podcast. It's our longest standing sponsor. He's an old friend of mine, Rudy Senecal. He founded the company. This is the software that I used at my yoga center for 10 years because I just hated Mind Body Online, and it is by far a better way to manage your center. If you have to do the work of scheduling and class payments and accounting, all of it can be made far easier and more efficient by using Karmasoft. I cannot recommend it enough. Do go check it out at karmasoftonline.com. All right, let me also drop some of my stuff. First, I want to give a big shout out and expression of deep gratitude to the live stream subscribers who beta tested my new teachers class. The last 2 weeks, a lovely group of people who subscribed to my live stream classes participated in these online calls where we delved into stuff that was important to us and to practice. And I'm just super excited about this new thing. I really feel like it's something that allows me to have real teaching and real inquiry and real exchange, even when we're not in the same place, in a way that I haven't had before. The live stream subscription is currently available. You guys can go get in on that right now, but the teacher's edition will be coming in August, and all the details are going to be coming out about it. But just, I know a lot of you who were in on that call are listening to this, and I just want to say thanks, you guys. It was really fun, and I just think it's a pretty amazing way for anybody who listens to this podcast who wants a weekly opportunity to actually engage in the conversation yourself and be able to ask questions and have debate and have your inquiry bounced off other people's inquiry. This new weekly teacher's call is a very cool way for us to do that, and you'll be able to find out about that soon. Also, I've got some dates coming up. I'm going to be at the Feathered Pipe Branch July 14th through 21st. There's still a little time left. I'm also going to be at the Yogi Underground in Falls Church August 10th through 12th. And I'm going to be at Wainwright House in Rye, New York, August 26th. You can find out about those gigs and more. You can find out about the live stream subscription and my other video products. I've also got DVD and downloads and an online workshop. All that stuff can be found along with the archives of this podcast and my blog. All of it is at jbrownyoga.com. Also, if you're getting something from the podcast, you might do us a solid and show a bit of support. Go to a blog or podcast page and make a direct donation, or go to Apple Podcasts and iTunes and write a review and give us some stars. We would be very appreciative if you would make that gesture. Okay, I think that's it. I think I did it. I managed to make this intro happen, and even as I got going, I think I may have actually even found a little fume of enthusiasm. All right, y'all. I will touch base with you on the other side. But let's get to this. Let's listen to this talk that I had with Beryl Bender Birch.
So do we have time to chit-chat for a minute? Or are we on breakneck pace here?
No, we're not on breakneck pace. We got all the time in the world. I don't got anywhere I got to be. Do you have to be anywhere?
No, I looked at your schedule and I saw, all these options to book an interview, and they were every 15 minutes. I went, oh my God, does he do an interview every 15 minutes?
No, it's just the way that the scheduler works, so that you have lots of options for people to have start times at different times. But I would need usually it takes at least an hour to have a good podcast talk.
Oh, good. Do you do editing, or you just let her run?
I just let her run, usually, because I want to just capture the conversation that we're having.
Good.
Sometimes there's a little light editing if there's little tech glitches or things that can kind of come into play sometimes that, in the course of a conversation that you can cut out so everything's a little bit smoother. But I think the beauty of podcasts are when they're not edited and produced too much.
I agree. I love podcasts, and I like doing them. I like listening to them. Where'd you grow? Just a quick question. Where'd you grow up? You seem like a California child.
You hear it. You have an ear. I grew up in Los Angeles, and then I moved.
Oh my God! No, I didn't hear it. I'm just.
What made you say? I feel free to jump in. What made you say California in the sound of my voice? Because I worked hard to kind of get the California boy out of my voice. But you heard it.
I heard it with the sound of your voice. Trust me, I wish I could say that it did, but it was just, I don't know. It just seems like, I don't know where it came from. It just seems like that just popped into my head. And after I said it, I thought, oh no, maybe he's a New Yorker, maybe, but California just came out of the ether.
Well, your intuition is strong. I spent my first 18 years in Los Angeles, but then I spent the majority of my adult life in New York. So it's sort of like both true.
You're like me. I grew up on the East Coast. I spent, after college, I went to school in upstate New York, and then I came to New York City and worked in the city after school and then I did that for about 5 years, and then I went, this is it. I got to move to the country. So I moved to Los Angeles, and I lived there for 4 or 5 years, and then said, no, I have to really move to the country, and I moved to Colorado for 8 years.
All right, so wait a second. So when did you go to New York? What year was that?
I was born in New York.
Right.
And I grew up in New Jersey, went to, grade school and whatnot in New Jersey, and went to Syracuse University. And then I came back to New York City and worked in the city for about another 5 years. So it was the late 60s. I was in the city, and then I moved to California in 1970. And that was, the 70s in California, the early 70s was, it was like the epicenter of the human potential movement. And it was just a great place to be. I'm doing an interview in the next couple of days about some photographs I took back in the 70s. And I had to look through a lot of old contact sheets and journals. And I was like going, oh my God, no wonder I do. And reading about some of the stuff we did. But no wonder I don't remember too much about it. It's like,
wow. Well, I was born in Los Angeles in 1972, shortly after you got there. And did you have any brush up against yoga before you went to LA? Like, was there yoga in New York that you were aware of in the late 60s?
That's a really good question. I don't think so. No, I mean, there was, but I was not doing it. I was trying to be an actor. I was doing a lot of TV commercials and extras, movies, and it seems like I may have gone to a yoga. My first yoga class was with Yogi Bhajan on Melrose in Los Angeles in 1971. And then, and I got a job just by happenstance working at the Biofeedback Research Institute. And when I started to work there were only the two directors and me, basically. They wanted someone to help them with this. They were doing this study on using biofeedback instrumentation on meditators and measuring the brainwave patterns of people who meditate. And I was like, oh, this is cool. So I met Choyam Trungpa Rinpoche and spent some time going back and forth to San Francisco to take meditation classes with him. And I met a Jain monk by the name of Munishri Chitrabhanu, who was the first Jain to come to New York. And I took classes at the Shivananda Yoga Institute and went to lecture with, he was still Baba Ramdas then at UCLA. I think that was 72 as well, 71 or 72. Yeah, it was a pretty interesting place to be. There was a lot going on.
Yeah, I know. Anytime I get someone who was around at that time on the podcast, I'm always asking them, and it just seems like it was so crazy. There's like so many influences and everything was kind of bursting. And I'm curious, did you study something in college that would have set you up to be working at that biofeedback place? What did you study in school?
Philosophy and English.
Okay.
And that I really wanted to be a theoretical physicist. I wanted to study cosmology and maybe astrophysics. My dad was a scientist, and although I didn't know it at the time, I was critically dyslexic and didn't learn that about myself until my late 40s. I always thought that I was as smart as other people in my science classes, but I was much slower at being smart. I mean, people would be handing in their exams and I'd still be trying to figure out the questions. And so I just had a really difficult time memorizing, and but things that were logical, like thinking, like back then it was, all the existentialists. So we were reading Kant and Hegel and Kierkegaard, and so, and those were all the heavy duty questions of like, why am I here, and where do we come from, and what's the point of all this, and so I started asking those questions early, and I was able to get A's in English and philosophy, and I didn't do so well in creative writing. I remember my professor told me that I was just that unedited stream of consciousness. What did he call it? Purple prose did not make interesting reading. And I was like, oh, well, I guess I'll never be a writer. And
you weren't structured enough, eh?
Was not structured enough, but fun, interesting. One of the things about all my books that I feel that I am pretty good at is bringing structure into it, that I can really come full circle with an idea or a story. I'm very visual because of this dyslexia. I think I learn, if I can't visualize something, I really can't remember it, or I can't learn it.
Oh, I completely understand. I'm dyslexic myself, and I was never diagnosed formally, but I just think my whole life I would always figure out a way to do what needed to be done, but I was never doing it the same way. And I remember like anytime there was like a math quiz, I could get the answer right, but I couldn't show the right work. But I've always been just sort of devising in my own head the way to get to it. But it's usually like it's a different way than you're supposed to, or everybody else seems to be getting to it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally understand.
What did you have the most difficulty with, like numbers or letters or just directions? Or
I think mostly like reading comprehension on tests. Like I was a smart kid in AP classes, but if I had to like read a paragraph and then they would ask me like sometimes a specific question, it would take me longer to read. Like it takes a lot of energy to read. So if I was under a time constraint and I had to like read something, like I didn't see stuff backwards, like I didn't have that, but it would take me a lot of effort to like take in a passage, and also I do know that. And that's the same. Yeah. And I think just in general, I just found that I was always, I don't know, kind of, again, coming about it from a roundabout way. And people would be like, why are you doing it that way? I'm like, I don't know. That's the way it makes sense to me, Yeah.
Apparently that skill, that can be cultivated into a skill, and that many sculptors are dyslexic, which gives them this ability to see things kind of three-dimensionally, like to walk around something and see it from a lot of different perspectives and come at it from a different direction. I think that's one thing that if I'm a good yoga teacher, which I do have a little bit of confidence in. I don't know anything about sailing or Chinese cooking, but yoga I feel confident in. I think it's because I have this. When somebody's when I'm working with asana, for example, I'll walk around a person a couple times and try and look at them from a lot of different perspectives, and then I'll just get this hologram almost of what the issue is. It's interesting. I think that works for us in a positive way. In many ways, it may slow us down in reading, but I think we gain other advantages.
And I can talk up a storm, so it seems like you and me both, where we might not be able to get the math problem on the page the way they want. We can have a conversation maybe. Well, okay, so you're in LA right when I'm being born in the early 70s.
Oh my God.
You're meeting the Rinpoche. We heard about the Rinpoche from Cindy Lee. She was on the podcast. And then you're hanging out with Ram Dass, which that must have been pretty mind-blowing. Are you like...
You know what was...
Well, I was going to ask, are you taking psychedelics? Are you allowed to divulge that information? Or
Oh, of course. Who would... Of course you're allowed to divulge that. And I think anybody who was in California in the early 70s, if they missed out on that opportunity, it was quite a shame. In 76, I had a pretty profound peyote trip out in the desert. I was actually in Joshua Tree, and I was in pure white light samadhi for about 14 hours. I would say that was one of the most what's a good word? Certainly one of the most. It certainly catapulted me out there into the realm of reality and optional realities and altered states of consciousness and kind of illumined and opened up a whole world that I'd had glimpses of in meditation, and that was a pretty extraordinary experience. Yeah. And I looking at these journals the last couple of days, I realized, God, we smoked a lot of pot.
Yeah, well, that was the times. But it also
that was the times, yes.
But it also seems like it was changing, like in the earlier 60s and even the latter 60s, it was one thing. But once the 70s came around, it seems like things took on a different tone. And then it seems like a lot of you guys turned to Eastern spirituality. It seems like that was like Richard Freeman was on, and he talked about that same thing. He went to India, I think, kind of around when you did. I think I wrote in your bio, you went to India in 74. Is that right?
Exactly, yeah. And, when I went, I thought I was the last one on the train. I thought, oh, my God, everybody's been to India. Ram Dass has been. Andy Weil had already been. He'd been traveling around the world doing mushrooms. Houston Smith had been to India. Who's the guy in Search of Secret India? Paul Brunton. I mean, there are all these scholars and intellectuals in the wisdom traditions, Americans, and that had already been to India. The Beatles had been. They brought back meditation from Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and I thought, oh, I'm like so behind the times. And I spent 6 months over there. I spent a month with Jain monks and nuns observing silence, and it was an extraordinary time to be in India, because I traveled alone. I was alone on trains. And
I've heard it was quite a journey to get there. You didn't just fly to Delhi. You had to go to wherever, Germany, and take the train over the mountains. It seemed like quite a trek to get there.
Where did I fly through? I'd have to look at the beginning. I flew Beirut. I think we stopped in Beirut. That's in Lebanon. Somewhere that was in the middle of, civil war of some kind. Because I remember getting off the plane to have a little break, and that we walked from the plane into the terminal, and the whole walkway was lined with soldiers with, I don't know what the weapons were. They look like, what do they call them now? AK-47s or something. I mean, these weren't just little pistols. They were serious weapons. And I remember just blissfully walking into the terminal and walking back out again, getting back on the plane, taking off, and then landing. I spent a month in Bombay with my teacher, first with Chitrabhanu, and then started traveling up north, went up to Rishikesh and Hardwar, and spent a month in Manali, and went to a Tibetan camp in Manali, and spent about a month and a half there living with Tibetans that had just come over the mountains. I mean, it was an amazing trip. I was just looking at my pictures from India the other day as well.
Well, it's funny. I made a similar journey, but it was 24 years later. Like I went to Rishikesh and Manali and Haridwar.
You went to Manali?
I did.
Oh my God, I hear there's a holiday in there now. I couldn't believe it. I stayed in a little mud hut on the side of the mountain. There was nothing there except a little village market where you walk down and your vegetables in the morning, and I'd build a little fire and a little mud stove and cook my vegetables. What was it like when 24 later, so 74, 84, 94, 98?
98. I was there in 98. And it's funny you bring stuff up like that because I remember spending time in Puri, and since then there was a terrible storm that completely wiped it out, and so what was there before is not there anymore. Although I bet there's some parts of India that probably haven't changed as that much.
That's true.
But yeah, I'm curious. You mentioned that your teacher. You mentioned what was your name? Chitta. I'm sorry, Baru. What was the name of the teacher?
Chitra Bhanu. CHTRABHANU. Munishri, which means Muni is a master, or that's like a Guru Dev. Shri something or other. So I was very right. My training has always been in Jainism and Buddhism. The Jains and the Buddhists are very similar in their philosophy and their practices. It's a very like Buddhism. It's one of the few, maybe the only major world religion that doesn't require you those two to adopt a certain ideology or a certain belief system or a certain dogmatic point of view, which is what really drew me to the Buddhists and the Jains. The equivalent teacher in the Jain tradition to Buddha in Buddhism was a teacher called Mahavira, and Mahavira and Buddha were contemporaries. They both walked the earth according to history at the same time, teaching slightly differently. But and also one of the reasons I was drawn to classical yoga and the Yoga Sutra, because it seems so obviously influenced by Buddha's teachings and by the Four Noble Truths and the
Well, everything sort of happened in parallel, and there's that grand debate, like which came first, the Hinduism or the Buddhism, but it seems like they all came out of the same, ooze of the earliest times before we were writing shit down,
Yeah, I'm not a scholar certainly on history, and I'm not a real student of Hindu mythology. I know, going back maybe 3,000 years to the Indus Valley, that's apparently where the name Hindu came from. It was those people that lived on the other side of were called the Indus. And, Hinduism, again, although it does have an ideology, it doesn't have one particular, as you know, as most of our listeners know, it doesn't have one particular teacher. There's a whole, mythological, I don't want to use the word stable, but there's a whole family of gods and goddesses and teachers and great stories. I mean, Hindu mythology is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Were you studying yoga in that first trip to India, or were you mostly studying your Jainism and Buddhism practices?
Well, really, that was, for me, that requires one little sort of tangential story here, is that currently, and I'm sure you find this, Jay, is that in today's world, most of the general public, and even in the yoga world, sort of use the word yoga and asana synonymously. And because I was exposed to the 8-limb path, to the true the Ashtanga, not Pattabhi Joyce's asana system, but the other word for classical yoga, I knew that meditation was really a part of yoga. So when I was learning meditation from Chitrabhanu and from Choyam Trungpa from Rinpoche, they were just slightly different. Chitrabhanu used mantra. He used the mantra Koaham, who am I? He taught me mantra. Rinpoche taught basically Vipassana, or that 2-part Buddhist meditation technique, where first you calm the mind and you focus on just quieting the pond in your brain, in your mind, and then once you've had some success at calming, quieting things down, you can begin to just work on Vipassana, which is insight, but you can't have insight until you begin to settle the surface of the pond down so that you can look deeply. So one was basically more Vipassana style, which was just, being in the moment, present to present, moment to moment, present tense awareness. The other one was more about focusing, anchoring with a mantra. But Vipassana, same thing. You can anchor with the breath, or you can pull up the anchor and float a little bit and just be with whatever's coming up.
Well, I appreciate that a distinction about yoga as asana, because it is a kind of trick question in a way, right? If you're exposed to an 8-limbed path of ideas and you're exploring those, that's technically studying yoga, but it doesn't mean that you were like in Mysore doing jump backs with Pattabhi Jois.
I was not in Mysore doing jump backs with Pattabhi Jois. I never studied with Pattabhi Jois in India. I studied with him for several years in this country. I probably took 250 lead classes with him. I started teaching. I learned the Ashtanga Asana system from Norman Allen, who was Pattabhi Jois's first American Western student. And I started that in 1979 in New York City. And then I started teaching. Up to that point, I'd been teaching in kind of a Shivananda Iyengar mashup. And
So you had already been teaching asana classes, though, before that?
I started teaching asana in 1974 in Colorado. And I taught
when you got back from India?
Exactly. Yeah. I didn't have a place to live in New York. I didn't have a place to live in LA. My stuff, my mason jars and my baskets and a few little trinkets that I had.
Your satchel of some clothes and your guitar.
Yeah, my guitar, exactly, and a few things from the swap meets. We're all in boxes in various places, and I had a dog. My dog and I decided we're going to go to Colorado, and we went with a friend who drove out from New Jersey. And Les Femi, who was a professor at Princeton, a fabulous, well-known biofeedback researcher, great guy. And so Les was going out to visit his kids, and so when time came for us to be driving back, and I said, I don't think I'm going. And he was like, what? I said, I'm staying here. So he was a little annoyed, needless to say, and he left Timber and me and my suitcase sitting on the side of the road in Grand Lake, Colorado, outside the Pancake House, going, WTF, now what?
Yeah.
Oh, God. And
but was there already a yoga scene in Colorado in 1974?
I was going
That's what I'm saying. Because every time I talk about this stuff, like for people, frankly, some of like the younger teachers listening to the podcast and stuff, they don't always have a sense that nobody knew what yoga was really at that time. Much.
I started teaching. No, there was not a scene in the mountains of Colorado. I was in Fraser, Colorado, which was that and International Falls, Minnesota, are the two coldest towns in the continental United States. And I stayed there till 1980, 1979, 1980. And when I came back to New York, I started teaching, is when I met Norman in 1979. I started studying Ashtanga. And this is a great story. I saw him do a little demo he had 2 students, and I was like, oh my God, what is that? And he was doing this incredible athletic, he looked like a gymnast working out. And I'd never seen, I'd kind of made a fairly strong practice out of the Shivananda system, and my study in Iyengar yoga for 10 years in Colorado and California had brought a lot of awareness about alignment and modifications, but I'd never seen anybody practice like this. And I just flipped out. I went, that's it. I felt like I'd found what I'd gone all the way to India to find.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.